Welcome to OverBoost 19. OverBoost is a podcast interview series featuring discussions with speedrunners about their history in speedrunning and gaming and the runs they're passionate about. I am your host, PMC Trilogy, and with me today is DemonicRobots. DemonicRobots, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, thank you for having me.
So, I love getting to the sort of sometimes how the sausage is made, and I also usually start these with asking my guests some of the other stuff that they do. There's a lot of work that I think maybe people don't appreciate in the speedrunning community, organizing events, making tools, all these like auto splitters, stuff like that. Those are really important things. And another thing I wanted to highlight, and I have the opportunity to do that now with you, is that recently you've been doing a bit of video editing for Speedrunner and some other stuff. And I just sort of wanted to ask, first off, I wanted to ask, how did you end up getting into this role?
Yeah, so the person that I edit for, I actually don't do the content myself. I do it for a Twitch partner named Waifu, who I essentially was watching him, and he was discussing about how he wanted to break into YouTube. He was inspired by a lot of people like Tomato Anus, Easy Escape, those kind of content creators, and he wanted to get into YouTube and do some of the avenues that they were kind of doing, where he wanted to do video essays. So I was watching his stream, and I just thought, like, hey, he's looking for a video editor, and I kind of wanted to get into video editing because that's something that I enjoy. I don't really like the writing part of it. I'm not too big on like actually creating the video essay, itself and doing all of that. I just prefer, creating the videos and putting them in an interesting way. And he was mentioning he had some ideas, so I messaged him. I'm like, hey, I don't really have too many videos to show you. I didn't have any at the time that I could be like, hey, or look at this. This is my style. So what I did is I said to him, hey, I'll do the first video for free. No worries, no charge. You just give me the footage. I'll edit for you. You can upload it. If you like it, then you can hire me on. If not, totally okay. So I did the first video and he loved it. It was pretty much exactly what he was looking for. And so I ended up doing more and more videos for him. And we've eventually kind of found a style where he's starting to do video essays, which are really interesting because they usually are these really nice videos that kind of focus on one little specific thing. So that's pretty much how I got started. I got lucky at the right time in the right place, and he's been doing really good on YouTube, which I'm very happy for, because that means that it comes back to me, and it's just really nice to see that some hard work has been paying off, because I was working for him for about 6 months before he really began to blow up.
Yeah, it's really interesting to go around and I think one of the things that I want to highlight too is that I for speedrunners and maybe a speedrun audience, so often we're living in the world of Twitch, or if we're going to YouTube, it's for those personal bests or those world record recordings, which have their value, and certainly I watch them all the time. But I think it's really neat to sort of to point out the thing that you and Waifu are doing, which is creating these video essays on specific topics. And I think that, you're talking about Waifu having some success, and at the time of recording, I think the big one that was recently successful was the video focusing on the presence of RNG in Resident Evil 4. And I was curious if you had a take on what it is about that video, or if there are other videos that you'd want to highlight and say like, yeah, this really came together well, as saying like, this is why this got big on YouTube.
Yeah, sure. I think the main thing about YouTube and the reason why I like it is because it's a very good introduction to speedrunning for people who don't know about it. The first time that I ever learned about speedrunning was just I was randomly recommended a video on a System Shock 2 speedrun by M1, and that's what actually got me to speedrunning. I thought I saw the video and thought, wow, that is really cool. I want to try it. I never ended up actually running the game, but that cued me in onto what it is. And so I think that with his most recent video that you're talking about, the Resident Evil 4 world record analysis, it's just kind of interesting to see how lucky of a speedrun it is, because you always hear about speedrunners say, oh, I got bad RNG, I got this or that. And unless you have good knowledge on the game, you don't really know how much time he lost, how much time he saved, if he's actually did get bad RNG, if he's just kind of saying that he got bad RNG but he messed up. And I think that video kind of resonates with that feeling of really understanding the video in short little chunks, because Waifu, he has 2,000 hours pretty much dedicated to speedrunning. And I think that unless you had that amount, you couldn't really figure all of this out yourself. A lot of the research went into that video in order to actually get it into a digestible way of explaining it to people. And, it's a really good way to explain kind of how a speedrun works and some of the different variances and variables that a player has to expect and, with experience, adapt to.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that so much of the takeaway from the experience of playing a game over and over and learning strats and all that is this game knowledge that's not always going to be apparent. And I think what you're saying is right, which is that the video essay format allows some of that knowledge to be surfaced in a digestible video essay format. But let's get on to some history stuff. You already touched on it. You got one of my future questions, which is going to be, how did you learn about speedrunning? But let's go back to the start. How does gaming start for you? Is it from family, friends?
It kind of just ended up happening on its own from YouTube. I grew up with a PC, and I played the earliest game that I can remember playing was like a Hot Wheels PC game when I was way young. And then eventually I got like a PS2 and all that stuff, and I started watching a lot of Let's Plays. All of the typical kid stuff of being like, whoa, that looks really cool, and like, oh my god, you can record your gameplay and not have it be like a camera, pointed at the screen. Like, that was mind-blowing to me at the time. And so I ended up just kind of falling into horror games mostly. And then I moved on to more shooters, and I've kind of bounced between genres. I usually have like a 3 to 6 month stretch where I'll like be hyper focused on some kind of genre, and then I'll move on or do something else. Recently that hasn't been the case. I've been sticking with speedrunning for a lot longer than that, which is nice. But that's kind of what I did as a kid. I would jump around a lot to these different little pockets and genres and things like that.
Now, the horror stuff and I think kind of the first person gaming is going to be important for some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in the back half of the interview. Do you have like a first horror game experience that you would point as like, yes, this is where horror begins for me?
Yes, and unsurprisingly, that's Resident Evil 4. I grew up with Resident Evil 4 on the PS2 version, and boy, oh boy, did I play the ever-living crap out of that game. I think that for a long stretch of elementary school, I would literally like come home and just do my homework and play Resident Evil 4. Like, that was all I did for months upon months. I never speedran it because, I was like not even double digits yet, so I didn't have the conceptualization of trying to beat the game as fast as possible. But I did everything possible with that game multiple times over and over. I actually had in the game you're allowed 30 save files, and I had 2 memory cards that all had like full completed game saves on all 30 slots in both of them. So that is where I started. Eventually, I got a GameCube, and I started moving on to the other Resident Evils because those got ported over. So I did 1, 2, 3. Code Veronica, and then eventually 5 and all that stuff. So I've been a huge Resident Evil fan. That's kind of where horror began for me.
I have to ask, so I assume that all of the things within Resident Evil 4 you would have done, like playing on different difficulty modes and things like that. And then you said you didn't speedrun, or at least speedrun the way that we think of speedrunning now. Did you do any sort of challenge runs? I know I didn't play Resident Evil 4 that much myself because I think I would have been in college age when that game was around. But I do remember having friends who, before I had ever heard of a no-shop speedrun, were doing themselves challenge runs like that. I'm curious if you did anything of that nature.
Yes, actually. So a big inspiration for a lot of my early childhood is 2 guys. Their names are Nuji and Nathan. And what they did is they did these things called the 24-hour challenge for Resident Evil games, where it would be the 2 of them, and they would attempt to complete the main series RE games in 24 hours. And they had different stipulations to them. They sometimes did things where it was a random stipulation, like, handgun only first aid spray on Code Veronica or RE4 with a specific set list of which items you could have. And I tried to do that. And I actually did a couple of them where I beat, Resident Evil 0 to Resident Evil 4 in 24 hours, which, for most speedrunners, if you know the length of those games, they're usually all about an hour and a half. But as a kid, I had no idea about speedrunning tech, so it took me a little bit longer for all of those games. And that is like where I really got into like wanting to do YouTube and wanting to do challenge runs.
No, that makes sense. That to really pull from, I think especially having access to something like YouTube and the sort of the easy content from that when you couldn't get to other things really does make sense for why that would sort of attune you, I think, to to some of these later challenges. Now, I should also ask though, of course, besides some of these single player games, did you have phases with big multiplayer games, your MMOs, or your other types of shooters?
Yeah, definitely. Before I got into speedrunning about a year or so ago, I was heavily into Rainbow Six Siege, and I actually worked as a commentator for a couple more of the amateur semi-professional scenes. So, for example, I did the Challenger League qualifiers, I did the Paris Major qualifiers, I commentated for those, and did shoutcasting, which is basically like the play-by-play live action. Oh, this guy's running into the room, he's going to get a kill there, he's going to plant the bomb, all that stuff. So that was kind of my big stretch. I have about 1,000 hours into Rainbow, and I probably will never play it again, or at least not at that serious of a level. But I've always kind of been interested in like doing commentary or just taking a little bit step further in my interest of video games outside of being just like a viewer for them or just a player.
So now earlier you mentioned that your first exposure to speedrunning was, not surprising, through YouTube, and specifically through, I think you said a System Shock video. How do we get from, you seeing that YouTube video whenever that was to you then later doing speedrunning yourself?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because it's been an ebb and flow. I've been, teasing with the idea of speedrunning for a long while. So the video I watched, the System Shock 2 world record at the time, was by M1 account. And I watched the video and I thought that was really cool to just see a game that was so alien, just completely broken immediately. I liked the movement style of it. I thought the glitches were interesting, and I liked the length of it. So I eventually tried to learn it, and I actually never finished learning it. I ended up getting, I think, to the last 2 splits in it, and I was just like, all right, I can't do it anymore. My brain's way too smooth for this. So I put it down for a little while, and then I came back and I saw some Silent Hill runs. I think it was actually by Punchy, if I remember correctly. And then I tried doing those on emulator, but I never really committed to it because I didn't have a copy. And then there was a long stretch of me just not doing speedrunning at all. I didn't watch the content. I didn't do anything with it. And about a year ago, I was kind of in my Clock Tower mood, and I replayed through a game called Remother Tormented Fathers, which was a Clock Tower-inspired Italian horror game. And I thought, this looks kind of interesting to speedrun. And so I went to the leaderboards, and I saw who was running it, and one of those people was a YouTuber, streamer named Igdices. And I was kind of going through his list, and he has played a lot, and I mean a lot, of horror game speedruns. I think he has over 70 of them, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, no, I distinctly remember. I do watch him sometimes, and I very much remember when, of course, he got number 69. Who could forget that?
Yeah, 69 plus 5 or whatever it is.
Right, yeah, whatever the meme is now, yeah.
Yeah, and I watched him, and I saw that he was doing Remothered kind of around that time, and he was doing other games like Alice Madness Returns, and that kind of reinvigorated me. So I started running Remother Tormented Fathers, and then I kind of got bored of that game. It's a very short game. There's not a whole lot to it. So I started getting interested in other stuff, and then I really began to branch out. I did Extermination, which is a PS2 survival horror game. I did Raw Danger, which is a disaster survival game. And overall, I was kind of just on this nostalgia kick where I was doing a lot of PS2 stuff, and I didn't really find my niche for a long while, but eventually I kind of just pretty much saw, a casual playthrough or a speedrun of game and thought, hey, I want to speedrun that. And so that's kind of what ended up with Clock Tower 3, where it was one of the only Clock Tower games I didn't play as a kid, and I saw Igdices run it, and I thought it looked really, really fun. because I'm sure you know this because you've had them both on, but Possum and Nick Dicey's both explained it pretty well. Clock Tower, the series, isn't the best for speed running, especially Clock Tower PS1 or Clock Tower 2 and Clock Tower Ghosted, because they're point and clicks and they're essentially just cutscenes. But Clock Tower 3 is a very different beast from the rest of them. So that's what really kind of caught my eye about it.
Right, and I know Clock Tower 3, I think a lot of folks know that game, because of sort of changes behind the scenes, also just plays differently.
Oh, yeah.
Before we get too deep into Clock Tower 3, I did want to get some sort of takes generally about speedruns, because I think you've given us a good roadmap of how you got into speedrunning. And so I want to make sure I get it clearly on the record, because I know you said you never finished a System Shock 2 speedrun. So what was the first speedrun that you had completed?
Ooh, I think either it is Silent Hill, the first one, or Left 4 Dead 2. Left 4 Dead 2, though, it's very different from when I tried speedrunning it versus when the speedruns of it now. The speedruns of it now are fantastic and have a lot of really cool tech and all that stuff. However, I'm double checking my time on the leaderboards here. The time that I have right now is currently 35th place, and that was 5 years ago. And it is about an hour slower than the current world record. But at the time, it was I think second place, just because nobody had really caught on to the fact that Left 4 Dead 2 is a good speed run. So I think that was the first one where I finished a run more than 2 times.
Me? No, that's really interesting. It's as I interview more and more people, it's really neat to see the way people try runs and move on, because I think at times as viewers of speedruns or Twitch channels, things like that, we might come to associate, oh yeah, waifu Left 4 Dead 2, but we don't necessarily think about the history of the run or other runners who have also run it. So it's good. It's kind of interesting to see how paths cross and recross and so forth. All right, well, let's get some other takes here. Of all the speedruns that you've done, which one would you say is your favorite?
Ooh, that's actually kind of an interesting question. So I think that the answer is going to be Clock Tower 3, because, it's just the first game that I really dedicated myself to and really put a lot of time and effort into actively being the best that I could be at that game. A lot of the other games, I had very specific goals, and when I hit those goals, my interest kind of waned on them. And with Clock Tower 3, it never really happened like that. I would hit the goal, and instead of being like, all right, I'm happy with that, I would say, no, I want to continue. I want to push it even further and further and further until I am where I am at now, which not to sound braggy, but, I have the world record in all the main categories, and I got the final minute barrier broken for that game, and I'm just at the point where I don't have any other goals I can have for it. So that's really the main game that I would say. If I had to say mechanically in the in-depth of it, probably Dishonored 2, because it's such a heavily rewarding game for how skilled you are, and your times are tied to that to seconds, which I think is really cool to see how well you can optimize yourself, cutting those corners, doing those tricks just a couple of fractions of a second faster. And I like how rewarding it is for that fact.
Okay, but what about the flip side? Of all the runs you've done, what is your least favorite? That
is kind of easy and kind of not. So I've done some not amazing speed runs. And the two that I would say that I didn't enjoy pretty much at all was Clock Tower PS1, because it is essentially a hour-long cutscene. There is very little that you can do to speed it up, and there's literally strats where you're just clicking as fast as you humanly can in order to advance the very, very slow dialogue. There's pretty much nothing to Clock Tower PS1 that you can really dig into and do. But Alan Wake, honestly, is a speedrun that I really, really wish I liked a lot more, but it is 2.5 hours of running, and Alan Wake having the lungs of a smoker. The tech in that game is you run past all the enemies holding W and shift, and occasionally Alan will start wheezing for air. So then you let go and shift for a certain time, and then you hit shift again, and you just keep on repeating that over and over in a loop. And it's really a big shame, because I love the speedrun of Control, which is in the same universe and made by the same developers, but it's like they're just two different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I definitely the pace and sort of the ability to play into things and use movement options as much as they are in the same fictional setting and the same developer. Those two speedruns really do move at different paces. My last take for you though would be a game that you would like to speedrun, but either for time reasons or because it doesn't fit into what you're doing right now, you just haven't gotten around to it.
Yeah, so for a long while, I've actually wanted to speedrun the Fatal Frame trilogy. The main reason for that is at the time when I was looking into a lot of the different speedruns that I was interested in, I was kind of on a PS2, bender. I was playing Extermination, which is actually the first survival horror game on the PS2, and, Raw Danger, as I mentioned earlier, and, of course, Clock Tower 3. And I thought Fatal Frame would be a good transition, and I really liked all of the speed runs, and I like the idea of doing the Fatal Frame trilogy back to back, doing a trilogy run. It's also kind of a niche that a lot of horror streamers don't really fulfill. The only person I can think of other than Nick Dicey's is maybe Maxi Lobes, who really actively runs that game, and he only does 1 and kind of 2. There's not really a person that I know that's, actively does the Fatal Frame trilogy. So that's kind of on my list of what I want to do. But I just keep on getting sidetracked by a bunch of, different games. That's always how it goes with speedrunning. You're like, I want to do that, and then something else comes in and you want to do that instead, and then there's a third thing, and just it never ends.
Yeah, there's always more games, and there's always more speed tech too, which is, I think often something that motivates when we get around to things. And so we've talked about, gaming, speedrunning, your work doing editing. The last thing I wanted to get to was I don't think we've talked too much specifically about you and streaming and Twitch. Was your consumption of content mainly sticking to YouTube until you got more recently into speedrunning, or have you been streaming for a while and it just happens to be that only in the past year or so, I think as you've said, that you have stuck to consistently doing speedrunning stuff?
Yeah, with streaming, I actually didn't really watch, streamers too much. I never really found it interesting to watch a professional player do a game, play multiplayer games and PvP stuff. It just really wasn't my thing. It usually just ended up with me wanting to just play those games instead. And as for streaming, I did a little bit of it. I did mostly events, which weren't exactly ran by me, for sure. So I don't really want to say I was streaming, because I was mostly doing it as almost a job, where I was doing the shoutcasting and all that stuff for Rainbow Six Siege. So really speedrunning is what got me into Twitch actively, where I can sit and watch a streamer for a couple of hours and enjoy them and not feel bored, because I really like watching a streamer grind and actively improve. Because I think that's really why I like speedrunning, is it's an objective measure of how well you are doing at a game. With Rainbow Six Siege or Counter-Strike or any of those games, you have a rank, but almost every single person you ask will tell you that it doesn't really represent your skill. And that's really not the case with speedrunning. If you have a really good time, you're a really good player. There's nothing that can really be super lucky about it. And it's also an objective way to see yourself grow, because you can see, your time getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And also it's competitive, but it's not. I would like to say that it's passively competitive, but it's not actively competitive, because it's passive in the sense that, there's a leaderboard, you're trying to, get world records, you're trying to beat other people's times. But when you're actually doing attempts, you're going against yourself. You're only competing against yourself. You're not really focused on other people. You're focused on improving your time. And I think that's what I really like watching other people do, is I like watching them actively improve themselves, and doing it on stream. It's a really good way to show how much work and dedication goes into getting those times that they achieve and upload on YouTube.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it, because what it does is, speedrun streaming is it really presents a sort of, there's the narrative is often the same when you're watching someone, which is they're seeking to improve their personal best time, and that's something that you can jump in, and understand that part right away, even if it's not a game that necessarily you have game knowledge of. You can understand what they're trying to do, and of course, they might be explaining it too as things go along. All right, so one sort of final speedrun question here before we get into the back half of things, and I usually like to ask, as a speedrunner or a member of a speedrunning community, do you feel like you have a particular role or mission statement in speedrunning?
I almost want to say yes and no. For a long while with speedrunning, I kind of didn't really know what I wanted to focus on. If you look at my speedrun list, all of them are kind of horror games, or at least fall under that theme. But a good majority of them are, all these different genres from all these different timepieces. Clock Tower 3 is a survival horror game in 2003 on the PS2. Dishonored 2 is a 2016 modern PC action platformer. So I've really been jumping around a lot recently, but I've now am trying to fill the niche of kind of those really, I would say balanced. So I really want to find games that have a good balance of fighting, movement mechanics, out of bounds, and length. And the two current runs that I'm focusing on are Dishonored 2 and Control. And I think all of those have a good balance of all the interesting things about speedrunning. They're not super glitchy, but they're not, a completely glitchless game. They have a little bit of fighting, but not enough to where you are kind of forced to do it or you're running past every enemy. They're, good lengths of time. There's not like 5 minutes long or 5 hours long. And I think that's kind of where I'm starting to get a little bit more comfortable, because my shortest speed run is literally 5 seconds long and my longest is about 6 hours. So I've done the whole range, and I feel like now that I'm kind of focusing on those ones, I'm starting to hit that balance of what I like. And I think that's kind of just finding interesting speed runs that kind of showcase what speedrunning as a whole is really about.
No, I think that's a good way to put it. And it's, so often I think when we think of roles, people might throw out glitch finder or, grinding or things like that. But I do think there is itself when it comes to putting on a performance, defining things that are suitable for marathons or other things. That just the act of seeking out the run and, feeling out the run for yourself, that is something that is its own skill. That is its own, like, is this suitable for the sort of showcase that I might want to put on?
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that that I always keep in mind is, I remember I was doing a shoutcasting event one time where I was, it was a really big one and I was really proud of it. So I sent it to my parents to, see like, hey, look at this thing that I did. That's really cool. And they watched it and they went, hey, I like that, but I didn't understand any of it. And so I always have in the back of my mind, like, I want it to be, want to be entertaining, and I want to show runs and all that stuff that makes sense to the speedrunners who are watching it, but also to the casual player. It's why I really enjoy doing marathons, and I put a lot of work into exactly what I want to explain, because I always have in the back of my head, like, hey, if somebody who had zero context or zero understanding about this game, could they still understand it, or at least enough to enjoy it? And I think that is why I've chosen like Dishonored 2, Clock Tower 3, Control, We Happy Few, is they're all games where they can either see it without the context of the game and understand it and enjoy it, or I'm able to explain it in a way that they'll like it.
Yeah, no, I think that's the right way to put it too, because in terms of making something entertaining, you can do that sort of more educational bent, but also sometimes it is good to just launch yourself and go real fast, and everyone says, wow, you went real fast.
Exactly.
All right, let's get into some of these games then. In particular, we've already talked about Clock Tower 3 a little bit. Of course, this was the I think the first post Human Entertainment. Human Entertainment, of course, was I think the developer that made the first batch of Clock Tower games. This is the post Human Entertainment Clock Tower 3. How did you come to play this game? I know you said you were playing Resident Evil 4. You were playing survival horror, but this seems like a little more off the beaten path. So I'm curious how you came upon this one.
Yeah, so my introduction to the Clock Tower series was Clock Tower PS1. It's called Clock Tower PS1 in the US because the first one never came out here, but it's technically considered Clock Tower 2 because it's a sequel to the first game. Some people think it's a remake, it's not. And so that was my first introduction to it, and I was kind of looking on YouTube for a more modern one because at the time I was really curious. I wanted to see if they made any more of those because I really, really liked that game. And I saw that they had, hey, Clock Tower 3 on the PlayStation 2. That's really cool. So I typed in like Clock Tower 3 Scissor Man or something like that, and I saw the design as a kid, and I was like, what is this? This is this is absolutely ridiculous and dumb. And then I didn't touch it. And then a long time later, about like a little while back, a few months, I saw Dicey's doing the run, and I thought, hey, this looks kind of better than what I remember as a kid. So I got the game online and I replayed it, and I actually surprisingly enjoyed it. But mainly because at the beginning of the game, I said to myself that, hey, this isn't a Clock Tower game. I can't go in with the expectation that's going to play like that. I like to say that it is a really, really, really bad Clock Tower game, but it's a really, really good survival horror game.
Yeah, that seems about right. I think it's the rhythm of this game is very interesting. Even at watching as someone who has not played the game myself, because you have these kind of like more pure horror sequences, where you're just sort of escaping, which I think are maybe more in line with Clock Tower. But then you also have boss fights, which I feel like are a little less in line with things. I'm going to give you an open-ended question because I feel like with these kinds of survival horror games, the casual viewer, I feel like a lot of times we'll see a lot of point A to point B movement. And so there might be things going on that are not apparent, in terms of, what the difficulty is or where the choke points are. Now, in studying for this interview, I watched your ESA summer online VOD of doing this, so I had the benefit of some commentary, from you and some others in terms of what was going on. But let me throw it to you. What's the thing in this speedrun that you find the most interesting, or maybe something you found that you're proud of?
Yeah. So I would say that the most interesting thing about this run is the fact that it essentially has zero downtime whatsoever. You start the game, you don't have to watch the cutscenes. You pretty much are actively doing something at all time. There's very few points where you're not actively contributing towards getting a quicker time. I think one of my favorite things about it as well is that it's probably one of the best survival horror game speed runs that you can do because it's very easy to learn and very hard to master. If you go onto the leaderboards and you look at a good majority of the times, the difference between my run and 10th place is like 2 or 3 minutes. But getting a 1 hour and 21 minute time is significantly easier than getting a 1 hour and 17 minute time because of just a variety of factors with it. But it kind of just showcases what everybody likes in speedruns for horror games. Optimizing, lines or movement through rooms is kind of how I describe it. Finding interesting tech to manipulate enemies in order to pass through, solving puzzles quickly. It has a little bit of everything for the survival horror fan.
Yeah, I noticed that one of the most visually appealing things to me, I always love whenever things look as janky as possible. And I know that one of my favorite things is I think a few times through the run, you're able... So one of the defensive things that the player can do outside of the boss fights is throw holy water at these enemies that are pursuing them. And the holy water just goes through walls.
Yes, that is hilarious to me. So, and along with that, when you're throwing the holy water at an angle, facing it from, at the camera, it actually goes farther. So there's specific times where we'll kind of angle the camera in a specific way in order to get maximum depth. But it has some very interesting mechanics to it, because sometimes it'll lock on to the enemy automatically, but sometimes it won't. So one example of this is, let's say I'm running up the stairs and one of the main stalkers, Sledgehammer, is following up behind me. I don't have to turn around on the control stick and press the button to throw it at him. I just have to press the button and she'll immediately spin around and hit him. But then there are times when I am being chased by another character named Chopper, where I have to actively remember which angles to hit him at, because sometimes it just won't and it'll miss. Or Scissorman, that's kind of one of the big ones where he'll move too quickly for the lock-on to catch him, so you have to like properly time it yourself.
Now, speaking of some of these bosses, you're naming some of these bosses, and they're all very colorful characters, Chopper and Sledgehammer and so forth. Do you have like favorites and least favorites among the cast? Because I feel like there's sort of a lot. They are a lot of the flavor of the run.
Oh yeah, for sure. My favorite one for casually is Corroder, because he's a guy who likes his job. He enjoys what he is doing, and I like that energy. My least favorite for speedrunning is Corroder, because he is the most RNG focused boss. He gives you these random patterns. He can just screw you over and you have no counterplay to it whatsoever. And overall, he's kind of just the most annoyance and the largest reset kind of character. My favorite boss in the speedrun wise is definitely Lord Burrows, because he has the most tech to him. So if you don't know how the boss fights work in this game, essentially Alyssa gets a magical bow and arrow that transforms from her water bottle to that, and she shoots beams of light at the enemies until eventually she can shoot a really big beam from the sky to kill them or do a bunch of damage. And the game doesn't really allow you to aim. You hold down the aim button and it charges up your bow and you can release it and fire. And you don't really have control of it because you can't aim left or right. With the exception of one boss, it'll automatically aim at the targets. So the most dangerous thing to Alyssa is the enemy moving left or right, because you can't cancel your shot and you can't move left or right to track them. But a lot of the fights end up being trying to almost get them in a stun lock, where you're attempting to bind them to the ground in order to shoot off that large laser beam. And it's not exactly just, firing off shot after shot after shot. You have to have kind of a rhythm and an understanding of how the enemies move and all that stuff. But with Burrows, it's completely different. Burrows requires the usage of these special arrows. It's called a repellent arrow and a binding arrow. A repellent arrow does quite a good chunk of damage and knocks the enemy back, stunning them for a short time. The binding arrow, it acts as a fully charged regular arrow shot, but it immediately binds them, so you don't have to charge up your shot and then fire. And he requires a lot of movement and a lot of tech, because you have to start off the fight with not using any of your special arrows. You have to bind him naturally, and he has 2 health bars and is very dangerous. He also has a ranged attack where if you get hit even once, you're in trouble because it binds you. So it's a lot of firing, dodging, and finding a good rhythm. And then once you bind him, you have to have a very specific movement to avoid all of his attacks, to manipulate him into giving you the attacks you want, and to bind him to bring down his health bar as quick as possible. It's really a very hands-on fight, and it's kind of it's basically the hardest part of the game at the very end of it.
Yeah, no, that final boss fight with Burrows is very interesting. And there's even sort of a stinger to that fight too, because I think there's a moment where he's able to do a melee attack as you're running to sort of get the very final objective.
Yep, I have lost a world record pace run at the very end, because when you defeat the boss, it's not over yet. You eventually lose your bow and arrow, and you have to run to a specific spot in the stage in order to end the game. And he is standing in your path, and he has 3 attacks that he could do. 2 of them are really good, 1 of them is really bad. So the first attack is a purple orb that he shoots at you. If it hits you, it binds you in place and you can't move. If the other one is a pool of blood, where if you are caught in it, it'll slow you down and leave you vulnerable for another attack. And then the third one is him hitting you in the face with a sword that could rival Cloud's from Final Fantasy VII. And if he does that, your run is basically dead, because you're most likely either going to lose 10 to 15 seconds getting hit, or like getting back up and then backing away, waiting for another attack, going through, or you get really unlucky. He walks over immediately, picks you up, and powers himself. And then that's 30 seconds gone, which in this game, you basically just lost so much time that you can't really recover. And I have lost one record to that, and that was probably the angriest I've been in my speedrunning career.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a great time, especially right at the end there. That's just a little bit stressful. One sequence I wanted to ask about, because I think this was highlighted in the marathon commentary as being something where tight movement, good lines were really important, and I was just curious if you had anything that you wanted to say about. I think it's like a graveyard. You're being pursued by the Scissor Man. Yes. I think that seemed like a really tense situation. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yes, so that is the kind of most tense part, I think, for actually being chased. The main reason for that is this game doesn't have a traditional health bar. It's not like if you get hit, a bar goes down and down and down until you die. It has something called a panic meter. A panic meter is a meter that will fill up when Alyssa is scared. So either these can be events like a light breaking that will, send it up a little bit, or it could be from an enemy hitting you, and that'll raise it up. When it gets fully raised and it hits the top of it and you get panicked, you lose control of Alyssa. You can kind of guide her into certain directions, but sometimes she will stop moving and you can't move her at all. The main reason this is bad is because it also means that she is one shot. So if she gets hit, she dies. And since you cannot control her properly, it makes it so you are extremely vulnerable to enemies, because you also can't really use holy waters in the speedrun. And so managing panic is very important, because even if you don't get hit by an enemy, you can still get your panic meter raised, even if they just swing near you. So that's why Chomper is very dangerous in the graveyard, because you cannot use your holy water to stop him from swinging at you, whereas we can do that in the other parts of the game, because you only have 5 charges of it in that area. You need to use 2 charges to power one side of a portal, and you need to use 2 charges to power the other side, so that's 4 right there. And then you need to use a holy water shot to unlock a key item. So that is all 5 of your charges used. If you use one on Chomper, you actually cannot finish that area without taking a 2-minute time loss by going out of your way to refill. And while we can use items in the speedrun to mitigate this, it's still completely random, because his pattern is not very it's never static. And there's a lot of backtracking in that area, and overall, it's just very dangerous to do quickly. Usually we pick up 3 items for the speedrun. We pick up 2 lavender waters, which will reduce her panic, and we picked up an invisible ring, which will turn Alyssa temporarily invisible. And usually we use all of those items exclusively in that spot. We don't use them anywhere else really except for that one location. Just to manage the panic, manage where he is, and just hope for the best. And it's also kind of random if you'll actually need to use those items. For example, in my speedrun, I only use 1 item. I only use a single invisibility ring, which is extremely, extremely rare for that. Usually you'll end up using 2 or 3 items. And in this game, it's timed by RTA, and the menuing is very slow to load. So it ends up being just kind of a nerve-wracking moment halfway into the run as to whether or not you'll pass the gatekeep of that spot.
Interesting. Now, I have to ask, because this is a PlayStation 2 speedrun. Does this game, being timed RTA, are there any sort of oddities when it comes to loads or things like that? And in terms of model of PS2, or God forbid if someone tried to do a backwards compatible PS3?
Surprisingly not. I use a SCPH 90,000 model, which is the fastest North American version you can get. It's the kind of glossy PS2 Slim. But I timed it into my old model, which was 7,000, and I think there was a 0.5 second difference for all the loads in the game. And then I had a friend test it on their 3000 model, which is the big chunky PS2s, and there was like another second added on to that. So we haven't had anybody test the backwards compatible PS2, but I honestly don't think it would save too much time between that. And that's kind of the cool thing about it, though, is it makes it accessible. You don't need the fastest hardware to get a good time like in other games. And it kind of just means that really, as long as you have the game, you can play it and, be competitive in it. It's not like, for example, Ocarina of Time, where if you don't have that specific version on an old Chinese, console.
Oh, the IQ, yeah.
The IQ. It's not like if you don't have that, you literally cannot get a good time in it. And I think that's really cool. And even if you are playing on PAL or the Japanese version, because all of those are exactly the same in terms of, how fast they are, so to speak.
Yeah, I noticed that it seemed like, from the leaderboard, that the Japanese and American versions of the games were fairly interspersed, which kind of suggested to me there probably was not a substantial difference between versions.
Yeah, I think it's purely visual. I know right now the third place run by Mr. Silent Vid is a version. He plays on the Japanese version because he usually likes that style of games. I think the only difference is the voice acting, obviously, and it's kind of funny because it changes kind of how the characters are, in the sense that, like, if you compare to Sledgehammer's voice, it's this really brooding kind of, I'm gonna get you voice, and his voice in the Japanese version is much more higher pitched, and that kind of applies to all the other stalkers, and it's just hilarious because they go from like these kind of terrifying brutes, or like maniacs who you don't know what they're gonna do next, to like these almost comedic Power Rangers enemies, I would say.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. I feel like that we could have a whole other podcast about this, but I feel like that touches upon sort of how, because I feel like the way you're describing it in the Japanese version, they're almost like Power Rangers villains or Super Sentai villains, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. As opposed to, more straight horror villains, which is likely what the English language localizers were going for. Like, oh, well, they're British speaking and it's horror, so, we'll make them more brooding. That's interesting. I mean, that's the stuff of localization. So now you said that you've got record in every category in this video game. Do you feel like right now you're pretty set on Clock Tower 3? If someone came and beat one of your times, would you come back and try and defend it?
Yes. I don't think my times are extremely set in place. There are 4 categories for this game. There is normal mode, which is any percent. There's clear mode, which is a hard mode, essentially. And then there's 100% versions of both of those. I don't really think there is much of an interest in normal mode 100% and clear mode 100%. There's only a couple of times on the leaderboards, and mine are the newest version are significantly faster just because there's new tech, and the people who were on it before didn't really grind it out. Clear mode, I definitely think I could have an improved time on, along with normal mode, because I want to say those are the most competitive, essentially. I think it would be very, very difficult, though, for somebody to beat my normal mode time, because that one requires an insane amount of luck. I mean, it always comes down to that when you kind of get the final minute barrier, because and I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm not, unless we find new movement tech or something like that. It is pretty much impossible to get a 1/16. So it essentially only allows, a 55-second window of RNG and mistakes to build up. And this game, if you look at the top 5 times, they're all really close together. It's like a minute and 25 seconds separates us. In there, all of them that are in there have the potential to get really, really good times. But I think I'm pretty secure for now, unless, maybe a Dices or Silent Vid comes back and actively grinds normal mode, which I'm not sure they're interested in doing. Clear mode, however, I think that one could definitely be improved upon. The problem with it is it's an extremely hard version of the category and requires a significant amount of luck, where if one little thing goes wrong, there's literally no way that you could, complete the run properly.
All right, well, let's move on to the next one then. And that's going to be We Happy Few, specifically the We All Fall Down DLC. Before we get into talking about it, because I feel like there's a whole story to this game and the DLC and whatnot, but I first wanted to ask, because I wanted to highlight that for this particular run, I watched your recent SGDQ 2020 online run, and I wanted to ask, if you could get another run into a GDQ event, what one would you pick if you could have any one run?
Probably Clock Tower 3.
Yeah.
I think that is probably like my dream, so to speak, because that game's my baby. I think it gets a bad rap. I think a lot of people look at it and compare it to the other games in the Clock Tower series and just kind of write it off, or for being campy and silly, because it's a very Japanese style game. It was actually directed by Kinji Fukasaku for the cutscenes, who is a very, very famous film director who focused on Yakuza films and all that, and samurai pieces. But his big one, which is the one that a lot of Americans will know, is Battle Royale. He's actually the person who made that film. And so the cutscenes have that style of that kind of overacted, over-exaggerated, stage performance that you see in a lot of Japanese culture. And people see that and they kind of just go, it's too silly, not a horror game. And along with that, I also really like it because it has the holy water mechanic and all that stuff. It has good mechanics for those kind of chase stalker games like Amnesia or Outlast, but it's more than just getting spotted, running to a locker, hiding, getting out, getting spotted, running to a locker, hiding, and all that stuff that you find in those. And so I really, really enjoy it casually, and I think that's why I like speedrunning it so much, and I was so hyper-focused on not only getting the world records, but also getting good times in those world records. And honestly, I really just want to showcase this game to more and more people. I want everybody to know about Clock Tower 3, so definitely if I get an opportunity to do it at GDQ, I will 100% take that.
Awesome. Well, let's get to We Happy Few then. Now, specifically, I had asked the same thing with Clock Tower 3, which is how did you come to this game? Now, We Happy Few, I feel like, has a particularly interesting history as a game because everyone, I think, remembers the initial marketing, which sort of, I think, gave a lot of people the impression that it was maybe something more Bioshock adjacent, when really it then ended up being this more survival mechanics focused game. But then later on down the line, there were these 3 DLC campaigns that had more curated linear experiences. Now, the one that we're going to be focusing on is the We All Fall Down campaign, which again you had done for SGDQ 2020. What's your story with We Happy Few? Was this a game that you had been paying attention to since that initial marketing push?
Not really. So when that initially happened, We Happy Few was kickstarted and it kind of caught a lot of attention. Then it came out and it was a buggy early access mess. It's that typical Kickstarter story of the developers can only, fund so much of it. They put it on Kickstarter. The theme is really successful. They put it out as much as they can, and then they use the funds from that Kickstarter and the early access to finish the game. And the N8%, you can tell what happened is halfway through development, they simply changed the entire idea of how the game worked. So originally it was supposed to be an open world procedurally generated sandbox game. And I think they kind of realized that not only was that too ambitious, that's not what they wanted. So they eventually kind of tried to find this weird compromise, but for a more linear, kind of wacky, crazy, world story. And that's what we got with the main game. We got this hybrid of kind of procedurally generated open world, but kind of linear. It was a mess. And I think the DLC is really where they redeem themselves, because I think this is really what they wanted to do the entire time, because the DLCs are these very linear stories set in this world, and they're so much better than the base game. I would recommend, if you have this game, play the DLC, because they're significantly better, because they're these short, focused stories that are really creative and have really interesting level design and graphics and style to them. And that's kind of why I run the DLCs and I don't run the main game, because the DLCs are just such a better experience, and it's kind of like what you said. It's what people who expected this to be a BioShock-like game wanted from it.
And so I guess you were talking about sort of the history of the game. When you came to it, was it initially as interest for a speedrun, or was this something that you had played before sitting down with it as a speedrun?
I kind of have a rule that I don't like to play games. I don't like speedrun games where I play them casually, but I did kind of go into it with the idea that I wanted to speedrun the DLC, because I remember, like everybody else, I remember the main game. I didn't really like it. I played through it just to, familiarize myself with the game, but I didn't really enjoy it until I got to the DLC, and I really, really liked all of them. And so I kind of watched Ecdicys do it. Again, Ecdicys is a huge inspiration for me, and it's really what got my foot into the speedrunning doors, so to speak. And I just saw them, and I just thought they looked interesting. I thought that they had a lot of potential to be good runs. They're all like, these short little pockets. I think that they're also good playing back-to-back in a speedrun. And I just thought, like, this is so much better than the main game that I don't even want to do any % outside of a meme category of bad ending.
No, I mean, I did watch that. Well, I guess you did it in the GDQ VOD, the 5-second category, which is certainly interesting. But let's get into the run a bit then. So this particular one, I think, is very interesting because there's a lot of movement stuff going on, and in particular with both just sort of regular jumping as well as the whip mechanic, where the player is able to use a whip to reach up to ledges and grab things. I wanted to ask, there's a few trick jumps in this where it seems like you're trying to skip things by sort of turning in midair to grab onto a ledge. What goes into making that work?
Yes. So if you guys didn't know, the DLCs, they all have their own kind of specific niche of what weapon they have. They Came From Below has the ray gun, the Lightbearer has a guitar, and We All Fall Down has the whip, as he mentioned. The whip is interesting because you can use it both as a weapon and as movement, where you kind of catch yourself on these rope coils and that can fling you upwards to them. The way that the properties work is they're kind of a spherical kind of hitbox to them, where if you are as long as you are like a certain distance away from them, it doesn't really matter too much what angle you hit them at, as long as you are close enough to actually activate the prompt. So what you mentioned right there, some of those jumps are mainly due to the fact that we're just trying to blindly jump into the hitbox and hope we catch it. It is kind of forgiving in the sense that it's a pretty big window you have. It's not a frame perfect trick, but you can definitely mess it up, and usually you end up dying because you just plummet straight into a bottomless pit. So it's very cool because it's just extremely flashy to do. But essentially what we try and do is we try and find which ones that we can at least jump and reach. So there's a couple of them that we use. The one that I'm thinking of is kind of in the waterworks level, where you're going up an elevator and you're essentially trying to climb up this gigantic pipe by circling around and jumping at other pipes. If you've played Mirror's Edge, it's
I was going to say, that's the Mirror's Edge sequence. I knew that
exactly.
one.
The game takes place, it is heavily inspired by Mirror's Edge and Dishonored. So normally you're supposed to go all this way around, and then you're supposed to get on a platform and use the rope coil to climb yourself up. However, if you jump out the other side of the elevator, you can actually just skip that thing entirely and grab the coil. And it's pretty funny because the angle you're holding it at is you're jumping one way and then you're flinging yourself the opposite way upwards to catch the rope.
Yeah, the redirection at times is really neat to see. Sometimes grappling hook mechanics, or whip mechanics, I think are always pretty good in video games, although sometimes they can be rather wooden. But what I really enjoyed watching this was situations like that where you were able to sort of start yourself in one direction but redirect things. Or also, the other thing I always love using animations to cancel other things, and I think there's one part where the whip animation is used to cancel a falling animation, which is really, really flashy.
Yes, so I only used it a couple of times because when you there's two attacks you can do. You can do a straight whip, which is where she flings it forward, and then there's one that she does where it's kind of like a lasso where she'll swing it around to knock enemies back. If you do the lasso one, it's actually faster than getting the stumbling animation where she falls and kind of clambers on the ground to pick herself back up. And it saves time in a couple of spots because the game gives a little bit of priority to the fall animation when you're moving actively. So she'll slow down and then you have to like get back up and press sprint again and do all that stuff. The whip cancel does, it skips all of that. And there's one really interesting one where essentially we are in this gigantic facility and we're turning on the power to two different places. And then we need to get a key card for an enemy who is at the very bottom and we're at the very top. So what we do is we literally just walk off the edge and fall straight down. And if you whip at that very specific spot, you skip a super long animation of her falling to the ground, breaking her legs, and then climbing back up. She just, lands like a ballerina. And even though you still take the damage, you skip that animation. And we use that in a lot of specific areas when we had the stamina to spare it.
Now, I've highlighted some of the things that stood out to me, watching the game and listening to your marathon commentary. Are there other things in this run that you would want to highlight as being, particularly interesting?
Yeah, I think that some of the interesting spots is the first climb that you kind of do to get almost out of bounds, but not exactly. So in this game, you also get something called a dart gun, and you can use this to both stun enemies, and you can also use it to unlock doors. And one thing that you can do with that is you can kind of hit a trigger, and then you have to jump in a specific angle to climb upwards and to get a mantle, and then you can essentially skip a tiny little part of the sewers, and the game has a lot of that. Another one is something called the elevator skip, where we are walking on a platform that is suspended above water. And normally in the game wants you to go to an elevator and go down it, and then continue on the levels normally. However, there's a very specific jump that I unfortunately couldn't get in my GDQ run at the very beginning, where you start running at a corner, you catch the very last edge of the platform, and you jump, and you can just barely have enough room to reach and catch the like little bar sticking out. And it's a very cool feature, and it's just very fun to have like that tiny little skip in it because it's a short run and there aren't a whole lot of that. Another one was found by another runner where it's a death warp. So in the game, the entire world takes a drug called joy. It makes you be really happy and hallucinate, and it's compulsory. Every single person has to take it. If they see that you're not taking it, they'll try and kill you. And so we need to get into a facility, and the only way that we can actually get into it and pass through is through something that is called a joy detector. If you aren't taking your joy, it will alert everybody around you that you're off your joy, which is bad, and then it'll also make them want to kill you, and there will be a electric shock thing that will also try to kill you. So normally you either have to shut this off, which is slow, or you have to run through it and kill like 10 enemies in order to pass by. However, we found out that if you run through the joy detector, set it off, and then get killed by an enemy, it actually gives you a checkpoint where it puts you past the joy detector, but it also resets the enemy aggro, so they're not going to be trying to murder you. So you essentially can get through it and continue on to the level without having to kill every single person there.
Gosh, that's really fun. I love checkpoint abuse. And it's like one of those things where I think sometimes I as someone who likes to play a lot of like late 90s, early 2000s games, I worry that, you know, the seams of walls are too tight. It's getting harder to clip out of bounds sometimes. But thank goodness, the great news about software is that features can always be exploited. And
Exactly.
certainly checkpoints are one of those things where things keep. My very first speed game had a lot of abusable checkpoints. That was Just Cause 3, so it definitely speaks to me to hear that. Now, this, of course, the We All Fall Down DLC is in the context of a trilogy of DLCs, and so in asking, you know, the sort of exit question for this game, do you have future plans for this? I would also kind of expand that just to We Happy Few in general. I think you currently have the top time for a We All Fall Down, but do you have any future plans for We Happy Few?
Potentially. So I've done all the other trilogy DLC runs. So I've done We All Fall Down, They Came From Below, and Lightbearer. I have world record in all of them except one, and I've also done trilogy runs where I do all of them back to back. I thought about going for Lightbearer, which I really enjoy casually, but as a speed run, it's kind of the worst one out of all of them because there's a lot of forced waiting. So I probably won't end up doing that for a while, but currently there is another person who I want to highlight and give a shout out to, who is pretty much working on the game exclusively alone. His name is Votime. Votime is a very, very popular Dishonored 1 runner. He's kind of the main guy for that. If I'm going to double check his time right here on the boards to make sure I'm accurate, but I'm pretty sure he has world record in Mirror's Edge. He has world record in Dishonored, and overall he's a very, very good runner. So I'm hoping that he'll be able to break the game, and if he breaks it in a way that I actually am interested in, I'll probably end up doing the main game, because I know that's what his focus is right now. So I might actually end up doing the quote-unquote real game.
No, that's neat. I mean, I can already see. I'm looking at the We Happy Few leaderboard for individual act runs, and looking at the Act 1 leaderboard, it seems like he's already done some stuff in the game to really to push things down. So that's exciting, especially Mirror's Edge is no joke. That is that's a speed run. So to have someone of that caliber, working on a game like this, that's just exciting. That's just exciting to see what folks do like that do. So
to give context as to how much he's already broken the game, his time for Act 1 right now is 20 minutes and 9 seconds. Second place, which is by Mr. Monkey, who is a very good runner in the game and put a lot of work into it, his time was 1 hour and 34. So he has definitely been hard at work finding sequence breaks and skips and all that stuff. I know he's trying to break Act 2 and 3 because those are much longer and don't have as much tech as Act 1. So I think if he does that, he can actually kind of bring this game into quite a bit of popularity.
Yeah, no, I mean, if I think what previously the any percent good ending, Mr. Monkey, 4 hours, 26 minutes, that can be a bit long for some people, but if we're talking sub 2 hours or something like that, that really, I think, invites a lot more people into it, which is exciting. It's exciting just to see a run develop like that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
All right,
it's essentially it's almost like you could have a gold rush with this game. There is so much that is just begging to be discovered.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. Well, let's move on to the last one here, and I think this is a current project of yours because the PB of yours for Dishonored 2, specifically the Emily speedrun, I think it's pretty recent for you, and I think it's still something that you're working on with Dishonored games. How did you? I mean, have you played Dishonored 1? How did you speedrun that game? Because I know that was a popular speedrun. It's Dishonored 1 certainly. So how did you end up doing Dishonored 2 speedruns?
Yeah, so I didn't really have much of an interest in Dishonored 1. It was a little too competitive for me, and along with that, not to insult the people who work on that game and who like playing it, but it is a 32-minute run, and it has 20 minutes of cutscenes, which just didn't interest me in the slightest. So I looked at Dishonored 2, and it had no downtime, and it was a 22-minute run where you're constantly playing. And the thing that sold me on that game is the movement tech. Dishonored 1, it has the blink ability, but that's really about it. It has, elevators, which is where you mantle in a specific way to gain a bunch of height, but there's really nothing that you can do to make your characters faster. However, Dishonored 2 has a lot of movement glitches, and one of those that I want to highlight is something called leaps. So in that game, if you are mantling onto something and you have a free scroll mouse, or you're using a macro that's allowed to spam jump inputs, and you pull out your weapons, you will get launched 500 feet forward at max speed. So that allows us to do some insane stuff, and then you can bunny hop out of that. So if you look at a speedrun for it, you are just like doing all of these insane leaps and jumps and all these things. Another one is for Emily using her power. Her power is called Far Reach. It essentially is a grappling hook compared to Corvo's teleport. So you can use it to fling yourself not only forward and gain an intense amount of horizontal speed with a glitch called F canceling, but you can also bunny hop out of that as well. So you just launch yourself into any direction you want, going, 1,000 miles an hour, which makes it a really fun run because there's just like so much that you can do, just actively improving yourself every single second.
So you have successfully anticipated some of my questions, which is going to be asking about some of the differences of, why, as me watching, why is it that sometimes you were jumping and pulling out weapons versus using the Far Reach? And also, as the other thing I noticed too was that, there were times where it seemed like a major goal of yours as the speedrunner was to maintain, some momentum. And clearly I think that's the bunny hopping, in order to maintain that forward speed. But the thing then I want to ask is, this is all super cool movement tech, and it's really fun to watch, the player in a Dishonored 2 Emily speedrun just zip around. When it comes to routing decisions, how do you decide when to, leap versus reach?
That is a really good question. So typically the main kind of choices for Emily's route has to do with a variety of things, but mostly it has to do with mana control. So in the speed run, you have Emily's ability, but that costs mana, and sometimes it doesn't really give you enough of a reach. So there's either it's because we don't have enough mana and we want to save it for other areas, or is because we don't gain enough length. So about a minute into the run, we do a leap because A, we don't have our powers yet, but B, even if we did, you can't actually gain enough height to do so. And along with that, there are some areas where it just kind of works better. So on mission 2, there is an area when you right when you arrive at Karnaca. And if you don't get a specific bunny hop, you have to do a leap, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to leap into a rock formation and then slide up that rock formation to get to a platform that you can actually stand on. If you attempt to do a far reach, the game doesn't really let you gain enough height with the far reach. So you end up just kind of sliding back down instead of sliding upwards. So it also kind of lets you carry forward momentum just a little bit better, because the game's not really designed for you to be moving like that. And the game, is trying to stop you with a far reach because it's trying to control where you can and can't land. Whereas with a leap, you can basically just kind of move however you want to.
Okay, no, I think that makes sense. Certainly, I expected some of it was resources because, having played Dishonored 1 and watched Dishonored 1 speedruns, I was certainly familiar with the sort of principal importance of managing your mana for teleports. Right. And so to hear that be, a consideration in terms of when to leap versus when to reach makes sense. Now, I have not played, me, the interviewer, has not played Dishonored 2 myself yet. I should. I enjoyed the first game and all the DLC. I should just play it at some point. But I did want to ask, without knowing the game too well then, I was maybe sort of unequipped to evaluate. Are there any sort of big sequence breaks? Now, Dishonored as a game is sort of structured almost, often Hitman style, where you're going to a place and, choosing to deal with people, sometimes lethally, sometimes non-lethally. And I wanted to ask, in terms of sequences, are you able to use these movement abilities to sort of get around things?
Yes, so it depends on which character you're playing as. Emily has her far reach, which, like I said, acts as a grappling hook. So we can use it to gain some forward momentum and to B-hop and a lot of other stuff. Corvo is a blink, so it's basically a teleport. So you can't teleport and then immediately blink because you just don't have your forward momentum compared to Emily. So it actually makes his mana route, we were talking about mana routes earlier, it makes his a lot more strict because you're going to be blinking a lot more to make up for that difference. But with Emily, you also get a specific way to clip out of bounds. So one of the coolest ones I have is, I believe it's mission 5. You essentially go to this mansion and you're bouncing back and forth between two separate timelines. And at the very end of it, you get out of the mansion and you have a kind of confrontation with the outsider, the mystical being who gave you those magical powers. If you remember him from the first game.
I do.
And and normally it's a really long-winded thing where he gives some history and all this other stuff. And, speedrunners, we don't care about the story. So you're actually able to clip out of bounds in very cool ways. For Emily, you are able to clip out of the room and to avoid the trigger, which puts you on this gigantic plane, which you can eventually bunny hop over to where most of this is supposed to take place. The cutscenes and all that stuff showing some of the back history and story of the game. And you essentially, what you do is you clip out of bounds, you jump on over, you jump on top of the box of the room where all this is supposed to take place, and then you just clip right up to the very end, and then you just take the portal and leave. And with Corvo, you clip out of bounds in a different way. And because you don't really have time to get over and you can't clip downwards into other areas like Emily can, what you end up doing is you end up clipping out, you fall off the edge of the world, you respawn back into the area with the outsider where he's doing the cutscenes. But because you have access to your weapons, which you're not supposed to, if you shoot him, it ends up breaking the cutscenes and you could just go to the very end. So you essentially completely skip this, long, boring, arduous cutscene. And it's just really cool in the ways we do it. And it's also a great example of highlighting how broken Emily's far reach is. Because you can do this in game right now, you don't need to practice at all. What you do is you essentially hold your far reach, you look upwards. If you see that your far reach is extended out as far as you can, and you'll know this because you'll be able to see the hand actually able to activate, meaning you're looking up and you can far reach forward. If you activate your far reach and immediately look down, you just clip straight through the floor. Every single spot, it doesn't matter what flooring, you'll go through it. And so we use this in a speedrun to do things like do that skip that I just mentioned. You can use it to get into the Duke's vault early on without looting the key. And you can just essentially, if you just want to explore the out of bounds, you can just do that literally anywhere in the game and it works.
That's excellent. I love out of bounds that are so permissive that you can just explore the level, like especially parts of the level you're not supposed to be in. That's actually always really, really fun. I mean, it's so fun, right? There's a whole YouTube channel about it, boundary breaking. So unsurprising. Now with this game, I know that as I said, this is a recent thing for you that you're still sort of working on. What's your long-term plan for Dishonored 2?
So right now I am bouncing between two categories. I'm bouncing between Emily and Corvo for any percent. So I want to ideally get a 22-minute time in both of those. Right now at Emily, I'm at a 23:10, so I'm pretty close to that. And with Corvo, let me double check what my time is. I'm currently at a 25, which I think is actually out of date. Let me double check that. But I also want to get a 22 in that one. I thought about doing the other categories, which is non-lethal ghost and all collectibles. Non-lethal ghost, though, is kind of funny because the game, as speedrunners, we kind of prioritize what the game tells us over what actually we see with our eyes. So in the game, it actually tracks how merciful you are and if you get undetected. So as long as it says that you were stealthy and you were merciful and you didn't kill anyone, it's good to go. So if you watch a Dishonored 2 non-lethal speed run, you'll see that essentially every single person we just kill in a very convoluted way to where the game technically says that we didn't kill them. So for example, there's one character where if you stab him, he will die and you will fail the non-lethal part. However, if he gets into an elevator and you cut the wires to the elevator, the game considers you as not killing him.
I mean, it was the fall that killed him, you know?
Exactly. Another thing that we do is we have an NPC, and what we do is we set a flammable bottle behind them, and we slide into them, which causes them to fall over, and they land on the bottle, set themselves on fire, and die. So it's actually really funny that, like, we do all of these things to essentially have a more complicated way of killing them. So,
yeah, that feels almost like a hitman, like pro assassin sort of thing, rather than non-lethal.
They're all accident kills.
They're all accident kills. That's exactly right.
So I thought about doing that, but it didn't interest me enough too much. And then all collectibles, I'll be honest, I'm just not good enough for it. It is a very tech-heavy game category because getting the collectibles isn't difficult, but essentially you have to have fantastically perfect movement. I mean, it's very much like if you look at Bernie and Sierra Death, those guys have put an insane amount of work into the game. They've been running this game for 4 years straight practically. Sierra has over 1,000 hours in pretty much running this game alone. So you watch them and it's just like they're on another level because there's so much movement you have to do with the leaps, with specific, mana routing and all this stuff that like it's just way too difficult for me to even get a competitive time in. So right now my goal is just any percent with Emily and Corvo, and then I'll most likely eventually move on to the no powers category where you don't have your blink or your far reach to move, so it's purely reliant on leaps.
Cool. Well, look forward to that, folks. If you want to see that, if you want to see Dishonored 2 content, you know where to find it. Now, let's move on to sort of the wind down questions here. One of the things I like to do to provide a little connective tissue between interviews is to get a question from my previous guest for my next guest, and so on. Now, my previous guest was Maxi Lobes, and Maxi had this question to share, which was, if time or money were not an issue, what games would you like to play for the first time that you haven't had a chance to experience, outside of being a viewer?
Ooh, that is a really good question. I'm assuming this is, just for a casual playthrough rather than...
Right, I think that's the idea.
Yeah. This is a very hard one because I'm trying to go through my backlog because there's so many games that I want to end up doing, but essentially my goal is to play through every single PS2 game. The PS2 is my favorite console. I grew up with it, and I would just love to just go through every single one. And there's so many good horror games, which is my niche, that, like the Fatal Frame series, Ruler Rose is another one, Kuon. So a lot of those are also very, very expensive. You can look up the prices on them and they're just insane. So if time or money wasn't an issue, I probably would end up just dedicating myself to a project like that of just going through every single horror game. And, PS2 game Lifeline, for example, is one of them. Just all of that good stuff.
No, that's good. Now, that does mean, though, I do need from you for my next guest, and of course you don't know who this is, but you can assume that they are a speedrunner and a person playing video games. But generally the idea is that it's some sort of, can be more generally gaming or more generally speedrunning question. Maxi's was a good example. Other questions have been things just like favorite soundtrack, or if you could mix two consoles to make a new console, things like that. And so a question of that nature for my next guest.
Let me think about this for a second.
Yeah, take a second.
I got a good one. If you had 1,000 if you had 1,000 hours to get a world record in a game, and to get the best time that you possibly could, basically a task level game, and you had 10,000 hours to do it, and no worries of time or money, what game would you dedicate yourself to in order to achieve that goal?
So the gist is, if you had basically 10,000 hours to focus in on a game, get the best time you could, task level strats, what game would you dedicate yourself to?
Exactly.
All right. Going forward into the great future, what are some games that you are excited for that are coming out?
I am really excited for Cyberpunk. I originally wasn't, because I'm not a huge fan of The Witcher. I think it's a good game, but I don't really love open world games. I prefer more linear stories. But looking at it, I can't help but see just so much potential speedrunning wise. I mean, it's going to be an insanely long game, of course, but it just looks like there's going to be so much interesting tech and movement and, different categories. Like all the different factions, there would probably end up being categories that, get one ending with one faction and the other. And I think it's also probably going to have a good balance of routing potential and trying different strategy because of the, pure choice that you have in those games. That's kind of like what I don't really love about GTA 5 speedruns, is essentially you're kind of just, you don't really have much of a decision in order to beat the game. All the missions are these linear stories, and I think that's kind of a big criticism that Rockstar has. So the fact that this game will essentially, have the driving style of GTA 5 with combat like a Call of Duty game and the open world choices of Witcher, I think it's going to make a good combination of all of that and make for some insane speed runs in the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I feel like there's hunger for an open world game. Rockstar has made some very pretty and very polished open world games in the past decade. But playing them is often akin to acting out a script or engaging cinematography, which is to say that, we, the player, are barely doing anything. It's to the point where, I love it when people share footage from a Rockstar game where they're sent to kill someone, but they didn't kill them the right way, and so they fail the mission for killing that person.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, you just are essentially like, there's not really a level where you're literally, it's like, oh, you can do this stealthily or you can do it loudly. You don't really have that option. And I think with Cyberpunk, it's going to be like, you could do it stealthily, you could do it loudly, you could sneak in, you could kill somebody and wear their skin. Like, there's literally going to be, limitless options for a lot of the missions. And I think that means that it's going to be a constantly changing route for the next couple of years after that game comes out, of just people, finding like, hey, this is slightly faster. You can do this differently. If you, take this side path to pick up this item, you can do that instead. And so I think that's a really cool feature, and I think it's going to be like a huge, festering ground for a lot of new runners, and it's also going to get people really popular and famous, which I think is a very cool thing as well, to see people, putting in the work of a speed run and getting the, recognition from it. Yeah,
that's one of those things where, I think maybe we as people who are more inside baseball, we can look at random PS2 games and be like, oh, hell yeah, that's a speed run. But, in terms of getting folks recognition for their work, popular games are popular, which is fine. I'm not, out here to criticize folks for liking, for example, Last of Us or something like that, but it is, always exciting to see a popular new release turn into a well-deserved recognition. I think, we've seen that recently. Resident Evil 2 Remake was a big one. And there are other games like that. And it's always exciting to see that, to see that attention go where it's deserved.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that.
All right. Well, where can folks find you if they wanna see the Demonic Robots, Dishonored 2 experience or other things? What platforms should they be looking for you on?
Yes, so I am a Twitch streamer. You can find me at twitch.tv/DemonicRobots. If you were interested in some of my Twitter content, which is usually where I post, a lot of speedrunning related things, and I also kind of post my PBs and links to any videos or PBs that I have on YouTube, you can find me at Demonic Runs on there.
Awesome. And of course, those links will be available in the description wherever you're watching this. If you're, or excuse me, listening to it, if you're listening on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or YouTube, look down in the description. You will find the links as well as links to the videos that I studied in preparation for this interview. Demonic Robots, thank you so much for giving me all your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to spotlight some of my favorite speedruns.
Excellent. Now, you might know, though, that I do need one more thing from you before we end the podcast, which is that I'm going to say a cheesy catchphrase like, let's boost on out of here. And when I do that, I need you to give me your best rocket engine noise.
Oh, man. All right, let's do this.
Okay, folks, thank you so much for listening. Let's boost on out of here.